The first week of the Interplanetary Academic Exchange was always chaotic. 400 students, 32 species, and zero common ground beyond a shared cafeteria and mandatory orientation. Inside Lecture Hall 6B, a towering Cernari named Ickle adjusted his translator collar and glanced at the humans seated beside him. "Your species is known to experience high levels of nociception," Ickle said, his voice flat. "I find it curious you engage in full-contact sports recreationally." The human, a young man with a shaved head and a navy blue hoodie, grinned awkwardly. "Yeah, we're weird like that," he said. "I'm Chris Jamison." Ickle studied the human's face. "Ickle, I specialize in comparative anatomy. I have reviewed your species' pain thresholds. They are inefficient." Chris raised both eyebrows. "Well, thanks for that." The lecture began, but Ickle continued observing Chris. Humans, he had learned, had complex responses to pain: crying, screaming, fainting, and they often tried to hide it. Ickle found it irrational. On Cernari, pain was a communal response. If one hurt, all were alerted. Their nervous systems were wired for it. After class, Ickle approached two other exchange students, Laren, a crystalline being from Veltra, and Sunith, a thin, four-eyed aquatic from the orbital colonies. "I have begun first-hand observation of Homo sapiens," Ickle said. "Initial impression, they fear pain to an illogical degree." Sunith flicked a membrane dismissively. "They scream when they get vaccinated." Laren chimed in, his voice like clinking glass. "I heard one fainted after stubbing a toe." "I will test further," Ickle said. 2 days later, the biology lab was buzzing with activity. The assignment was simple: dissect a synthetic exo-organism, record neural architecture, and avoid contaminating the samples. Easy. Chris worked with Ickle, who insisted on leading. "You should let me handle the scalpel," Chris said. "You keep cutting through the nerve clusters." "I am more familiar with the structure," Ickle answered. "Stand back." Chris shrugged and reached for a vial of stabilizer fluid. As he did, Ickle's arm twitched an involuntary stress reflex among Cernari and knocked the scalpel from the tray. It fell, blade first, onto Chris's outstretched hand. The sound it made was sharp and wet. "Ah!" Chris stumbled backward, clutching his hand. Blood dripped between his fingers, dark and fast. "Medical emergency," Ickle barked, stepping away. "You're hemorrhaging." Chris sat down hard on a stool, holding his injured hand with his good one. "Yeah, no kidding," he muttered, his face pale. A human instructor ran over. "What happened?" "Scalpel drop," Chris said through clenched teeth. "Hit the webbing between my thumb and pointer. It's deep." The instructor pulled on gloves. "We need to get you to the med unit now. Apply pressure. Ickle, help me keep him upright." "Is he dying?" Ickle asked, eyes wide. "No," Chris answered, breathing hard. "But it hurts like hell." They got him into the med unit within 5 minutes. The wound was deep enough to require 6 stitches. Chris lay on the table, sweat on his forehead, pain clear in his expression. "Don't move," the medic said. "You severed a couple of small vessels. We're going to numb the area and clean it out." "That's fine," Chris said, voice thin. Just do it." Ickle stood outside the glass wall, watching. He had never seen such open pain expression. Chris didn't scream, but his jaw was clenched tight, his breathing shallow. The medic began stitching. Then something strange happened. Chris chuckled. It wasn't loud. But it was unmistakable, a short, almost disbelieving laugh. "What's funny?" the medic asked, not pausing. "I was just thinking," Chris said, eyes still closed. "This is the second time I've needed stitches before midterms." Ickle tilted his head. "You are laughing?" Chris opened one eye. "Yeah. I mean, what else can I do? It sucks, but it's not like Kring'll fix it." Ickle said nothing. Back in the dorms later that night, Ickle met with Sunith and Laren. He laughed, Ickle said. "While bleeding, while receiving pain treatment." "Impossible," Laren said. "I saw it," Ickle replied. He laughed, Sunith blinked, "but humans are afraid of pain." "I believed that," Ickle said. "Now I am unsure." 2 days later, Chris returned to class with his hand bandaged and stiff. Ickle sat beside him again. "You are still healing," Ickle noted. "Yeah," Chris said. They say about 10 days for the stitches to come out. You laughed, Ickle said. Why? Chris didn't grin, he looked serious. Because if I didn't, I might have panicked. Pain's scary. But sometimes laughing's the only thing that keeps it from taking over. Ickle looked at him. That is illogical. Maybe, Chris said. But it works. Ickle wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the injury or the laugh. 3 hours after their next joint lab session began, Chris winced as he tried to grip a centrifuge vial with his bandaged hand. Still compromised? Ickle asked, not looking up from the data console. Yeah, Chris muttered. Fine motor controls off. I can't twist anything without feeling like the stitches are tugging. Then let me handle the vials, Ickle said, reaching for them. Your continued engagement risks tissue disruption. Chris stepped back, flexing his uninjured fingers. Appreciate it. I'm not trying to reopen anything. Ickle placed a gloved hand on the sensor pad, activating the centrifuge. You should be in recovery, not handling volatile samples. Chris leaned against the lab counter. I wasn't going to miss the enzyme mapping run. We've been prepping this for a week. You prioritize the assignment over your bodily integrity. Chris gave a short breath through his nose. I mean, yeah, it's important. Ickle's gaze lingered on him. That is inconsistent with your species' behavioral caution patterns. We're not all wired the same, Chris said. Some of us just push through. But you are still in discomfort. I see micro flinches when you move that hand. Chris looked away. I'm not trying to pretend I'm fine, it hurts. I'm just not letting that stop me. Laren approached the station, translucent limbs reflecting the lab's UV lights. Ickle. The instructor assigned us to monitor the protein sequences from your group. Ickle nodded. We are initializing the data stream now. Laren's facets shifted as he turned toward Chris. The auditory emissions you made during your injury. That sound, was it a distress signal? Chris blinked. What sound? You expelled air suddenly and vocalized at a regular volume. It was not a scream, Laren said, but it seemed involuntary. Oh, Chris said. That was a laugh. Laren paused. You emitted humor during physical trauma. Chris hesitated. I wasn't joking, it just came out. Like a reflex. Laren turned to Ickle. This contradicts our pattern database. Humor is not typically deployed during harm events. It was not a premeditated response, Ickle said. He described it as an emotional containment strategy. Chris scratched the back of his neck. It's not like I planned it. I was trying to keep from spiraling. If I focus on what's funny, I can stay grounded. That is not an adaptation we have encountered, Laren said. Do all humans behave this way? Chris shook his head. No, some cry, some shut down. It depends on the person. Ickle turned back to the console. The sequence is stabilizing. 2 hours later, the lab ended and students filtered through the wide glass doors into the corridor. Sunith waited just outside, one hand gripping a hydration coil. You're still upright, Sunith said, eyes narrowing at Chris's hand. I thought soft tissue damage would require immobility, Chris shrugged. Not unless there's nerve involvement, this is just surface stuff. Ugly but manageable. Sunith rotated his head 30 degrees, a common orbital gesture of intrigue. Your species processes pain with remarkable inconsistency. Chris exhaled. We don't like pain, nobody does. But we deal with it however we have to. Then why return to class so soon? Sunith asked. You gain no additional life cycles for endurance. Chris leaned against the wall, suddenly tired. Because missing one thing makes it easier to miss the next, and then the next. I've been down that road before. Sunith stared at him. You have experienced cumulative failure, Chris gave a tired nod. Freshman year. Broke my ankle, skipped 2 weeks, fell behind. It took me a semester to dig out. I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen again. Sunith said nothing for a moment. Then, we assumed your kind fled from pain instinctively. I mean, we want to, Chris said, but sometimes you don't get that option. Fascinating, Sunith murmured. You endure not out of apathy but determination. Chris gave a weak smile. It's not noble, it's just necessary. Later that evening, in the communal study hall, Ickle, Laren, and Sunith convened at a corner booth. Each held a different model of data slate, but none were reading. He continues to function while compromised, Ickle said. He continues to engage with tasks that increase probability of discomfort, Laren added. Sunith folded his limbs beneath him. And he does not seek social reinforcement for it, no performative suffering. No emotional currency. He does not appear to value the pain itself, Ickle said, only what lies beyond it. Laren's crystalline structure pulsed faintly. Their relationship with suffering is not avoidance, it is negotiation. Sunith tapped his slate once. This may require a reevaluation of our pain response models. Ickle stared across the room at Chris, who sat alone, adjusting a stylus between his fingers. The human's mouth was moving slightly, perhaps rehearsing a presentation. His injured hand rested cautiously on the table, palm up. He laughed, Ickle said again, softly this time. Not to deny the pain, but to survive it. Sunith glanced at him, and you believed their fear made them fragile. I was incorrect, Ickle said. They are afraid. But they act in spite of it. Chris rose from his seat and walked toward the exit, his movements still stiff. As he passed the trio, he paused. You guys talking about me again? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Laren replied, we are discussing the implications of your recent injury, Chris sighed. Yeah, that seems to be the trending topic. The way you manage your pain, Ickle said carefully, is unlike any model we have encountered. Chris considered that. I'm not trying to be a mystery. I just don't like being sidelined. You are not mysterious, Sunith said. You are instructive. Chris gave a dry laugh. Glad my hand gash is educational, Ickle leaned forward. Would you have laughed if the injury had been worse? Chris's face changed. He didn't answer right away. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe not. Maybe I'd have cried or panicked or passed out, but I'd still try to come back. The aliens were quiet. Chris nodded once and walked away, disappearing down the hall. Sunith folded his limbs tighter. They do not lack fear. They carry it, and they move forward, Ickle said, even when it costs them. Laren's crystalline core dimmed slightly. Then perhaps we misunderstood the shape of fear itself. 4 days after the incident in the lab, the bioethics seminar was moved to one of the smaller conference rooms, a circular space designed to encourage interspecies dialogue. The chairs, sized to accommodate a variety of body structures, formed a loose ring around a central projector. Ickle arrived first, carrying a noteboard layered with annotations. He positioned himself near the window, as far from the humidifier vents as possible. Chris entered 2 minutes later, his left hand now wrapped in a slimmer, flesh-toned dressing. He moved slower than usual and carefully avoided brushing the edges of the seat as he settled in. You are still favoring that limb, Ickle said without preamble. Chris gave a short nod. Tendons are still tight. I've got about 80% range back. Then you are not fully functional. I'm getting there. Sunith arrived next, his hydration coil slung across one shoulder. He glanced at Chris's hand but didn't comment. Instead, he took a seat directly across from him, folding his limbs with a practiced fluidity. Laren entered last, his surface briefly flickering through a spectrum of amber hues before settling into a cool indigo. As soon as the instructor loaded the first prompt, a case study about pain response in multisensory species, the room quieted. 55 minutes into the session, the instructor issued a discussion challenge. Consider the ethical implications of altering sensory thresholds in sentient life forms. Would reducing pain sensitivity be a universal improvement or a cultural violation? The room paused. Chris was the first to speak. If you dull pain too much, you lose the information it gives you. It's not just a nuisance, it's how you know something's wrong. Sunith tilted his head. But your species often mitigates pain pharmacologically. You intentionally suppress it. Yeah, when we need to function or survive something traumatic, but we don't erase it entirely. There's a line. Ickle tapped the edge of his noteboard. What function does tolerating pain serve beyond signaling damage? Chris leaned forward slightly. It teaches limits. You grow up falling out of trees or scraping your knees, you learn what your body's boundaries are. It's memory embedded in experience. That seems inefficient, Laren stated. Why not encode that information genetically? Because no one's born knowing exactly how far they can push themselves. You learn it the hard way. Sunith tapped two fingertips together. So you rely on discomfort to define self-knowledge, Chris hesitated. Yeah. Kind of. The instructor observed silently as the conversation deepened. Ickle's posture stiffened with quiet intensity. You laughed during an injury, he said, his voice even. Was that also part of self-knowledge? Chris blinked. You're still stuck on that. It disrupted every expectation we had, Ickle said. Your response was not consistent with fear, and yet all data suggests your kind should fear pain. Chris rubbed his jaw. I did fear it, I just didn't want that to be the only thing I felt. Sunith leaned forward. Then laughter was an intervention? Chris looked at him. I guess. Laughter can break a loop. If I let the fear spiral, I'd have frozen. Laren's surface dimmed. But you were alone in that moment. No one was providing comfort. I didn't need someone to fix it, Chris said. I needed to stay present enough to get through it. Ickle interjected. Would you have responded differently if the wound had gone deeper? Chris stared at the floor for a moment. Probably. I'm not unbreakable, but I'd still try to find something to anchor me. Even if it's absurd, Sunith's voice lowered. Absurdity is not a cornerstone of most pain response models. Well, it is for us, Chris said. Sometimes you laugh because the alternative is falling apart. No one responded for several seconds. The instructor finally spoke. The human perspective complicates the binary of avoidance versus endurance. Let's pivot to implications in medical ethics. As the lecture moved on, the students absorbed the shift, but the earlier exchange lingered like a subtle charge in the air. 2 hours later, after the session ended, Chris stepped out into the corridor, only for Ickle to follow a few steps behind. I have a question, Ickle said. It's unrelated to the seminar. Chris stopped. Go ahead. If you had known in advance that the injury would occur and that it would be painful, would you have still participated in the lab? Chris leaned against the wall, thinking. Yeah, I would have. Ickle's expression flattened. Even with certainty of suffering? I wouldn't have chosen to get hurt, Chris said, but I wouldn't let the possibility stop me from showing up. That's the line. Ickle narrowed his eyes. You accepted the cost beforehand? I didn't plan on it, but I know that risk is part of doing anything worthwhile. Ickle was quiet for a moment. Then fear was not absent, it was accounted for. Chris nodded. That's closer. Ickle stepped back. Your behavior still contradicts our projections, but it no longer appears random. I'm not trying to be unpredictable, Chris said. I'm just trying to keep going. That evening, in the second-level observatory that overlooked the Arboretum Dome, Laren and Sunith sat together, reviewing their behavioral logs. They process pain through self-regulation strategies that are emotional, not chemical, Laren said. And those strategies vary by individual, Sunith replied. There is no universal model. Laren's surface rippled faintly. Inconsistent, but adaptable. Sunith stared through the glass at the distant shimmer of artificial starlight. They do not seek to conquer pain. They fold it into their lives. Laren glanced at him. Then we must revise our assumptions. Pain is not always a signal to retreat. It can be a signal to persist, Sunith said. Below them, Chris walked through the garden level, one hand tucked into his jacket. He paused near a bioluminescent fern, exhaled slowly, and kept walking. Neither of the aliens moved. Sunith finally spoke again. They do not laugh because they enjoy pain. No, Laren agreed. They laugh because they refuse to let it unmake them. They watched in silence as Chris disappeared behind the tree line, the hum of the arboretum lights the only sound remaining. 3 days after the bioethics seminar, the Interplanetary Academic Exchange held its first mixed-species simulation, an annual event designed to test problem-solving under pressure. This year's scenario was set inside a mock spacecraft malfunction. a power failure during an asteroid field traversal. Participants were grouped in fives, randomly assigned, and sealed in a pressurized training module filled with artificial gravity, dim lighting, and a constant low hum meant to simulate failing life support. Chris ended up in Unit 7 alongside Ickle, Laren, Sunith, and a new addition Vale, a tall, branching Arthexian with segmented limbs and no visible mouth. The simulation began with a shudder, and the lights dropped to a dull red glow. A synthesized voice announced a breach in the ship's central coolant lines. "We have 23 minutes before core meltdown," Vale translated, their voice emitted through a small device at their neck. "We must initiate a reroute and secure all adjacent systems." Chris was already crouched by the diagnostic panel, scanning the blinking lights. "Looks like the coolant's leaking from Junction E. That's under the support grating." Sunith hovered over a screen mounted to the ceiling. "I'm rerouting auxiliary power to maintain temperature balance. That buys us 8 minutes. Ickle was already peeling away a panel near the floor. "The leak must be sealed manually. Who among us is narrow enough to fit inside the conduit?" Chris looked toward the floor grate. "That shaft's maybe half a meter wide. I can get in." Laren clicked a warning tone. "It's unstable. There's pressure fluctuation and possible microtears in the lining." Chris pulled off his outer jacket. "We've got thermal gloves and patch foam. I'll be fine." Ickle turned toward him. "You are still within your healing phase. Manual strain could reopen your prior wound." Chris didn't look up. "It's not the same hand, and I'm not going to let 10,000 credits worth of equipment fry because I sat this out." "Risking physical harm for a simulation," Laren said slowly. "You understand there is no actual core meltdown." "I know that," Chris said, already unclipping the grating, "but if we treat it like a joke, we don't learn anything." Vale extended one limb across the opening. "You must maintain contact at all times." "This simulation includes kinetic pulses to mimic turbulence." Chris nodded. "Got it." He slid into the shaft, arms tight to his sides, navigating the narrow tunnel with slow, deliberate movements. The red lighting dimmed further, casting flickering shadows across the metal interior. Back in the main chamber, Ickle stared at the entrance to the shaft, his features unreadable. "Why is he so willing to risk damage, even now?" Laren asked. "He perceives value in the act itself," Sunith said, "not merely the result." 12 minutes in, the ship jolted. The lights flickered again and the simulated turbulence kicked in. The conduit groaned. "I'm at the junction," Chris called out, voice echoing faintly through the narrow space. "I see the breach. Foam's going in." Ickle called back, "Do not rush." "You must maintain stability." Chris didn't answer immediately. Then, "Something's wrong. The foam's not sealing, it's leaking through a secondary crack. Redirect your application," Sunith advised. "Widen the patch radius," Chris shifted. A dull thud rang through the conduit, followed by a short exhale. Then silence. Laren's frame rippled with alarm. "Chris, still here," Chris answered, breathing hard. "Caught my side on a bracket. Just give me a second." Inside the conduit, Chris pressed one arm around his ribs. The fabric was torn. He could feel warmth spreading through his shirt. "You are injured," Ickle said. "Exit immediately." "Not yet," Chris said. "If I pull out now, the seal will collapse. I'm finishing this." "You are bleeding," Vale stated flatly. Chris let out a low breath. "Yeah, I noticed. You are alone in the shaft," Ickle said. "Why do you persist?" Chris's voice was strained but audible. "Because that's what I signed up for. We've got under 5 minutes. I can hold out." Another pause, then a faint sound, short, sharp. "Did he just laugh?" Laren asked. "I believe so," Sunith replied. Inside the shaft, Chris was holding his side, one hand applying foam while the other braced against the wall. The laughter had bubbled up without permission, a dry, almost incredulous sound. "Something humorous?" Vale asked. "No," Chris said through shallow breaths. "Just this always happens. Every time I think I'm past this crap, I get stabbed by a pipe in a fake spaceship. It's so stupid I had to laugh." He adjusted the seal, applying the last of the foam in a circular motion. There, done, pressure's stabilizing. Ickle moved to the grating. Can you return? Give me a minute, Chris said. His voice was quieter now. I'll crawl back slow. 3 minutes later, he emerged from the shaft. His shirt was soaked along the left side and a jagged tear exposed a shallow gash beneath. He sat down heavily against the bulkhead, eyes closed, breathing fast. We need to call the med team, Laren said. No, Chris said immediately, opening his eyes. Wait until the timer runs out. We're still in the sim. Your performance is no longer required, Sunith said. You have demonstrated sufficient competence. Chris looked up. That's not why I stayed. I finished because it mattered. Vale extended a segment toward him. You are aware this entire event is artificial, Chris nodded. That doesn't make it meaningless. Sunith crouched beside him. You laughed again. Chris's tone was dry. Yeah, it's that or punch the wall. You do not mock the pain, Ickle said. You recognize it, then continue. Chris looked at him. What else can I do? The simulation ended with a chime. The lights returned to normal and the door to the module slid open. A pair of med techs stepped in, alerted by the biosensor spike. As Chris was lifted onto a portable gurney, Ickle stepped forward. You continue to act against your own safety. Why? Chris didn't speak right away. Then he said, because fear's always going to be there, I just don't want it to be in charge. The med techs wheeled him out and the door closed behind them. Back inside the module, Laren finally said he did not suppress his pain. He accepted it and chose to act regardless. Sunith's voice was low, and he did not do it for reward, nor recognition. He acknowledged the absurdity of his situation, Vale added, then completed his task. Ickle stood silently, facing the now empty shaft. They do not avoid pain. They argue with it. And sometimes, Laren said, they win. 6 hours after the simulation ended, Ickle stood in the observation corridor outside the med unit, his arms crossed behind his back. He hadn't moved since they'd wheeled Chris through the sliding doors. The corridor was empty except for a handful of passing staff, none of whom addressed him. His noteboard was untouched under his arm. At precisely the 7th hour, Vale approached in near silence, their segmented limbs gliding over the floor with deliberate grace. They halted beside him. You have not left. The human is still inside. Vale adjusted the translator node at their neck. He is undergoing dermal regeneration and internal sealing. The injury was not critical. Ickle didn't turn. It was not fatal, but it was completely avoidable. He knew the risk and acted anyway. He had other options. Vale's limbs remained motionless. He believed none of them sufficient. A soft chime sounded from the med unit. The door slid open and Chris emerged slowly, one hand bracing the frame. His shirt had been replaced with a generic patient tunic and his side moved stiffly when he walked. He looked paler than usual. Ickle stepped forward. You are ambulatory? Barely, Chris muttered. They patched the tear, said I didn't rupture anything major, just muscle strain and a slice. No stitches this time. Vale tilted their upper segment. You should be in horizontal rest. Yeah, I'm heading there. Chris glanced up. Why are you both here? You exited the simulation injured, Ickle said. We required confirmation of your status. Chris leaned against the wall, exhaling through his nose. I'm not trying to make this a habit. You pursued resolution while actively deteriorating, Ickle said. You did not hesitate. I hesitated plenty, Chris said. You just didn't see it. Then why proceed? Chris looked down the hallway as if searching for words. Because there's something worse than pain. Regret. If I'd backed out and everything failed, I'd have to live with knowing I could have fixed it. Vale's translator buzzed softly before producing a response. You are attempting to manage potential future distress by enduring actual present harm, Chris nodded. Yeah. That's about right. Ickle stepped closer. You calculated that the psychological cost of inaction outweighed the physical consequence of injury. Chris gave a tired nod. I've made the other choice before. Didn't go well. Vale extended a limb slightly. Then your response was not instinctual. It was informed by previous outcomes. Pretty much. Fascinating, Vale said. Chris pushed off the wall. Look, I'm not trying to impress anyone, I just didn't want to freeze up, that's all. You did not freeze, Ickle said. Even when your physical systems were compromised. That doesn't mean I wasn't scared, Vale lowered their limb. Fear and action are not mutually exclusive in your model. No, they're usually tangled together. Ickle's gaze narrowed. You did not override fear, you carried it, Chris nodded. It's not about shutting fear off, it's about not letting it decide everything. Vale turned toward Ickle. This contradicts our baseline assumptions. I am aware, Ickle said. Chris straightened slowly. Are we still talking about me like I'm a data glitch? You are a deviation, Ickle said. But not anomalous, Chris blinked. That's a weird compliment, but I'll take it. Vale's form shifted slightly. You are not unique in your response, but the clarity of your behavior has clarified a missing parameter. Ickle nodded once. We believed pain to be a control mechanism. You have demonstrated it may also be a compass. Chris raised an eyebrow. A compass? It does not only direct away from damage, it can point toward what you're willing to endure, Ickle said. Chris didn't respond right away. Then, that's a better way to put it than anything I've said. You did not need to articulate it, Vale said. You demonstrated it. Chris gave a lopsided grin. Well, glad I could bleed for science. You should be resting, Ickle said. I'm going. Just needed to walk a bit first. Vale stepped aside to let him pass. You have altered our understanding. Chris walked off down the corridor, one hand pressed lightly to his side. Ickle remained silent for several minutes after he left. Vale eventually spoke. He did not express pride. No, Ickle said. He expressed necessity. 12 hours later, the 3 alien students gathered in an auxiliary study room off the main hub. They had requested the space without instructor oversight, an uncommon choice. Sunith was already waiting when Ickle and Vale arrived. I reviewed the simulation footage, Sunith said. His injury occurred at minute 13. He continued working for 7 additional minutes despite visible signs of distress. He did not request assistance, Vale added. He did not expect it, Ickle said. Sunith's eyes shifted focus. We have considered pain as a limiter. This human treats it as a boundary to negotiate, not immovable but contextual. Vale's limbs folded inward. He does not seek pain, that must remain clear. But when it arrives, he engages with it deliberately. Could this approach be learned? Sunith asked. Ickle shook his head. It is not technique, it is framework. He carries experience that informs his threshold. Then this is not simply biological, Vale said. It is narrative. His threshold is not innate, Ickle said. It is constructed from moments. There was a long pause as each processed that. Sunith finally broke the silence. What does that suggest about our own models? That we may have overemphasized uniformity, Ickle said. We assumed pain dictated behavior, but perhaps it merely invites a choice. Then fear does not predict outcome, Vale said. Only possibility. Sunith leaned back, and the human chose to act. He did not act despite fear, Ickle said. He acted with it. Vale's surface shimmered briefly. Then we must redefine courage. None of them spoke for a while after that. Outside, the artificial day cycle shifted to dusk light. Beyond the glass walls of the study room, students moved between buildings, unaware of the quiet revolution in understanding happening just meters away. It was not a lecture or a discovery. It was a recalibration, and somewhere on the dormitory floor, Chris lay in bed, one arm over his face, bruised ribs pulsing with every breath. He was not thinking about pain or what it meant, or how it had been interpreted. He was thinking about how long he had to recover before the next lab. Exactly 4 days after the simulation, Chris sat in a sunlit corner of the Arboretum dome, legs stretched across a warm stone bench, reading something on a thin, scratched tablet. The bandage on his side was gone, leaving only a faint line of healing skin. He moved cautiously, but without hesitation. A nearby water feature burbled quietly. The midday light filtered through the dome's canopy, casting patterns on his face. Ickle approached without speaking, pausing at the edge of the path. Chris noticed him and tapped the screen off. "You're not holding a noteboard," Chris said. "Should I be concerned?" "I did not come to analyze you," Ickle replied. "I came to understand something I failed to before." Chris scooted over slightly, motioning to the other side of the bench. "You're welcome to sit. I don't bite, not professionally." Ickle lowered himself carefully. "Your species' humor is often difficult to parse." "Sometimes it's not meant to be parsed," Chris said. "Sometimes it's just there to make the silence less heavy." "I see." They sat in stillness for a moment. A group of students passed nearby, their voices fading quickly down the path. "When I first arrived here," Ickle said, "I believed pain was a binary factor present or absent, triggering retreat or immobility. I thought the logic was universal." Chris leaned back on his hands. "You're not alone. A lot of humans think the same way until something changes that." "What changed it for you?" Chris turned his head toward the dome's ceiling. 15. I was on a trail run with some friends, slipped on a wet rock, cracked my kneecap, couldn't walk. We were 2 miles from the trailhead, no signal. I had to crawl halfway back before someone found us." He paused, then added, "I remember crying at first, like full-on panic. Then at some point I just stopped. I started counting trees, naming birds, anything to keep my brain from screaming." Ickle blinked slowly. "Distraction?" "No. It wasn't about ignoring the pain. It was about staying in the same room with it without letting it take over." "You reframed it." "Yeah, it still hurt like hell, but the fear got smaller." Ickle tilted his head. "You did not mention this before." "I didn't think it mattered," Chris said. "But I guess we're collecting context now." They sat quietly for another moment. "I've noticed you haven't been logging anything lately," Chris said. "No scans, no slates, that's new." "I have enough data," Ickle said. "Now I am trying to understand the meaning behind it." Chris exhaled. "Good luck with that, meaning's slippery." "That may be why it matters." A soft rustle signaled another arrival. Laren approached, surface shimmering with pale blue light. He nodded once at Chris, then at Ickle. "I was told I might find you here." Chris raised his eyebrows. "You checking in on me or just enjoying the foliage?" "Neither," Laren said. "I wanted to ask you something directly. Go for it." "When you exited the simulation, you looked content, not proud, not triumphant, just settled." "Why?" Chris sat forward. "Because I'd done what I meant to do. No one else had to get hurt. The problem got solved. That was enough." Laren studied him. "You did not require acknowledgement. I didn't need a medal for doing what I thought was right." Sunith arrived next, gliding across the path with a pouch slung across his torso. He stopped just short of the bench. "There's a rumor circulating that you refused post-simulation commendation." "I didn't refuse it," Chris said. "I just didn't go pick it up. Seemed unnecessary." "You declined symbolic reinforcement," Sunith said. Chris scratched his temple. "Look, I get that recognition matters for some people. I'm not knocking it, but for me, the result was the reward." Sunith stepped closer. "Then your motivation was internal regulation." Chris gave a small nod. "I've failed to act before. That's worse than pain." Laren shifted slightly. "We previously assumed pain was the dominant deterrent in your kind, but for you, it is not the threat, it's what you might regret that dominates." Chris looked at him. "I don't want to be the person who freezes again, that's all." Sunith lowered himself to sit. "This is not resilience. This is identity preservation." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling it? You maintain your sense of self by acting in accordance with your chosen values," Sunith said. "Pain is not irrelevant, but it is secondary." Chris tilted his head. "I've never heard it put like that." "But yeah, that tracks." Ickle turned to him. "You have changed the way we interpret suffering." Chris shook his head. "Nah, I don't think I've changed anything. I think you just hadn't seen the full picture yet." Laren's surface darkened briefly. "We had not. I used to think fear was something to beat," Chris said. "Then I realized it's just part of the ride. You don't have to prove anything to it. You just have to keep moving." A quiet breeze stirred the leaves above them. Sunlight shifted across the path, dappling the stone. "Then you do not consider yourself brave?" Ickle asked. Chris looked at him for a moment. "I consider myself stubborn." Laren's crystalline exterior pulsed faintly. Your behavior has reframed our models. You have demonstrated that pain is not a universal endpoint. Chris stood slowly, stretching one arm overhead. I didn't mean to do any of that. I was just trying not to feel useless. You redefined function, Sunith said. Chris laughed. That's generous. I think I just wanted to fix what I could when I could. He looked at each of them in turn. You don't have to understand humans by watching us bleed. Watch how we keep showing up afterward. Ickles stood as well. And you intend to continue showing up, Chris nodded. You'd have to drag me out of this program to stop me. They parted ways not long after. Chris walked back toward the dormitory wing, steps careful but steady. The others remained a few minutes longer before dispersing. By sunset, a notification was posted across the exchange network. The behavioral models on human pain response would be updated, effective immediately. Not removed, expanded. It included no mention of Chris Jamison by name. But among the footnotes, there was a new term added to the glossary of interspecies behavioral frameworks: Jamison response noun. The act of proceeding through physical or psychological adversity, not through diminished fear, but through deliberate persistence shaped by prior distress. Typically accompanied by non-disruptive humor or quiet resolve. Not to be confused with recklessness. As night settled over the Arboretum dome, the lights dimmed to simulate a terrestrial dusk. Somewhere inside, birds cooed. The water feature continued its low, rhythmic flow. And for once, everything felt finished.